Everyone, and welcome to the special winter edition of OPG Live. I am professional photographer Ian Plant.
I'm Leah Zahner.
And we're here to help you become a better photographer and to answer your questions about photography. And today, I'm going to offer some of my favorite tips for winter photography before we dive into that part of the program and before I start answering your questions about photography. Leah, I think you have a few announcements.
I do. First, I want to ask, have you first checked out our Outdoor Photography Guide community gallery? If not, it's a really great place to go and check out. You can share your own photography, view hundreds of other photos that have already been submitted by the OPG community, and it's really easy to submit your photo. You can view the gallery, submit a photo just by clicking on the banner in the chat box, or if you're watching on Facebook, you're going to find that link in the description. That's my announcement. Other than that, we are sponsored today by Tamron. So with those two things said, I know we're ready to dive into some photos. I'll be keeping an eye right here on your questions. If anything relevant pops in while Ian's talking about a photo, I'll try and slide it in while we're on that photo. Other than that, we'll get to as many as possible at the end of the hour.
Trying to slide that in. In other words, she's going to brutally interrupt me to make sure that your questions get answered.
Exactly.
So winter is a great time for photography, and I know everyone gets real excited about photographing in winter. I see a little bit of snow on the ground and I'm thinking, ooh, this is going to be really great. But winter photography is actually quite challenging, and there are physical challenges for both you and your equipment, and there are artistic challenges as well. So I thought today I would talk a little bit more about what I do to get ready for winter photography. So as always, I'm going to share some photos as well to help illustrate the points that I'm making. So we might as well just dive right into the first photo. And so this photo I took in the Canadian Rockies in Banff National Park, obviously in winter. And my first photo tip for winter photography is look for open water. That is a very big challenge if you're in a cold place, like here in Minnesota right now. It is completely frozen over, and it's really, really hard to find open water. And when everything is completely iced over, if you're doing landscape photography outside, you're not necessarily going to have very interesting photographs because you don't have a really good foreground. So that's why I'm always looking for places where there is open water, because that gives me an opportunity to create a foreground shape that I can relate to my background. So for this particular shot, I spent days exploring the wilderness of the Canadian Rockies, looking for places where the streams, rivers, or lakes hadn't completely frozen over. So this was a small area that I discovered where there was some fast-moving water and it was still flowing. And so I was able to use the shape of the stream here as my foreground for this winter landscape photo. So search for open water. If you can find it, it gives you a lot of opportunities to make more interesting landscape photos when you're out there shooting in the cold. This next photo, once again, Canadian Rockies, this also illustrates that idea of open water, but it also shows another thing that I look for, and that's ice. Ice is nice. Ice is really fantastic when you're making winter photographs because ice is so reflective, and ice often has a lot of really interesting shapes. So I'm always looking for edges of ice where I can use the ice as a foreground for my landscape shots, or I can zoom in on the patterns and the colors in the ice for a more abstract, intimate shot. So for this particular shot, there was ice that formed on the stream. I was on top of the ice. Now, ice safety is very important. If you're looking to get to the edges of ice, where basically the ice ends and the water begins, there's always a risk that the ice there is not going to be strong enough to support your weight. So you have to be very cautious when going out on the ice to get to the most interesting places for photography. And so I generally look for ice that's a few inches thick. And if there's any question about how strong the ice is, I like to bring along a mountaineering ice axe. And this is the type of axe that mountaineers use to probe the strength of ice bridges over crevasses. So I just pound that ice axe onto the ice. And if the ice doesn't break, then I know it's strong enough to hold my weight. But I'm always very cautious. So for this particular photo, I was on the ice. The ice was actually quite thin. It was probably an inch or less. So it wasn't really that thick, but my ice axe told me that it was safe to stand on. But the water that was beneath me was no more than a foot deep. So I knew that if the ice broke and I fell in, the worst thing that would happen is I might get cold feet. So it wasn't particularly dangerous. If I'm out on ice that is over open, deeper water, that's when I get much more paranoid about it. So my advice is wait to find that really thick ice. But even thick ice, even, like where I live here in Minneapolis, every year people go out to do ice fishing on the lakes and things like that. They drive out there on their cars and their snowmobiles, so obviously the ice is thick enough to support the weight. But every year someone goes to the wrong place where, because there's a current or something else going on, the ice isn't as thick and they fall through and they die. So you have to be really, really cautious when you're out on the ice. It's a good idea not to travel alone, so bring a photo buddy, preferably someone who's heavier than you, and let them go forward. I'm kidding, of course. Maybe not kidding at all, but yeah, you know what I mean.
Our safety tips are pretty fantastic.
Yeah. Usually my safety tips involve bringing someone else along who is slower, tastier, and heavier than you are so that they can get eaten by the polar bear or they can fall on the ice, and that's how you stay safe. I know I'm a horrible friend. No one wants to hang out with me. All my friends are like underneath the ice or eaten by polar bears.
Who knew?
But they were good friends. They saved my life. In any event, it's a good idea not to travel alone. As I said, having that ice axe to probe the ice is a good idea. If I'm out on ice that's over deep water and I'm worried at all about the strength of the ice, I get really paranoid. I might put on something like a full-on exposure suit or a dry suit. So I've got a dry suit that I use for my winter kayaking that's designed to keep you completely dry if you go in the water. So I'll put on one of those if I'm really worried about the quality of the ice. And the best thing you can do is play it safe. So, be very, very careful when you're out on the ice, especially when you get to the edges of the ice. Now, if you really want to stay safe, but you still want to get great ice photographs, then one way to do it is to use a drone to fly over the ice to get to the edges of the ice. And I do that a lot in the winter, especially when I go up to like a place like Lake Superior, where there's often a pack of ice floes that forms and will kind of float around as the wind changes. It'll move around. It's not safe to go hopping on these ice floes, but I can send my drone out and I can get my drone to the edge of the ice floes and I can get some really interesting shots. It's really great in the spring when the ice pack is breaking up. And so I do a lot of drone photography when I'm worried that the ice might not be safe enough to support my weight. So that way I never actually risk my life. I'm just risking the life of my drone. So here's an example of a drone photograph I took on Lake Superior a few years back. This was in the spring when the ice was breaking up. So I never would have been able to get out and photograph this ice. You can see that these are just a bunch of ice floes that, some of them were really big, like that sheet in the middle that hadn't broken up yet. Some of these floes were smaller, maybe 20 or 10 feet across or 5 feet across. If I was really daring and bold, I could have tried jumping across each of the floes, walking out there, but that would have been pretty risky. Probably not very smart to do, but with the drone, I don't have to worry about my own personal safety. I can stay on the land and I can fly the drone out, and I'm not consigned to a knee level or chest level view of the world. I can go higher, and for this particular shot, I was a few hundred feet above the ice pack to get a wider perspective, to show more of the ice field, and to show make it a more interesting composition. So the drone has become an essential part of my winter photography. Now, another thing you want to do is wait for good light. Because snow and ice are very reflective, and they will basically take on the color of the light. And if you're shooting on an overcast day where the sky is gray, that means you're going to end up with gray snow and ice. It's not going to look that appealing. But when you have light, especially really strong, colorful light at sunrise and sunset, then the snow and ice will take on this really gorgeous color. So here's a shot from the Canadian Rockies. And this was early in the morning at sunrise, and so there was some nice colorful light coming in. There was a little bit of fog that was created by the disparity of the temperatures. There was some open water out there, so there was some moisture in the air, and it was really cold air. When you get cold air and moisture coming together, you can sometimes get these localized inversion effects, so you get fog or mist that forms. And if that's side lit or backlit, you can get a really colorful image. And so I'm always looking for opportunities for the weather breaking, to get nice, colorful, strong light, especially at sunrise and sunset, but even during the middle of the day in the winter, you can still get some great photographs because the sun never really gets that high. So you often get some really nice shadows, and the shadows on the snow turn blue because they're going to be reflected basically that light from the blue sky above is going to be illuminating the shadows. So the shadows will go blue, so you'll still have a lot of color and texture in your winter landscapes, even if you're making photographs in the middle of the day on a sunny day. So I do like to capture a wintry mood, and a lot of times I like shooting through falling snow. This is a photograph of a polar bear up in Alaska. And another thing to consider with your winter photographs is your white balance. And I think that it's probably a bad idea to try to correct the whites too much, because if the snow ends up looking neutral or a little bit warm, I don't think it really looks that good. I especially don't like warming up my white balance so that the snow takes on a little bit of a warm glow. I usually prefer to go the other way and cool my white balance down just a little bit, especially if I am shooting on a day where it's snowing and it's maybe a little bit overcast. So that way, instead of getting that sort of grayish snow, it takes on a bit of a blue tint. And that blue tint helps impart a wintry, maybe a slightly sad or nostalgic mood to your winter images. So just get creative with your white balance. I don't go too crazy. I don't shift it too far blue because I think then it just looks weird. But just a hint of blue tint is usually enough to convey a feeling of winter in your winter photographs.
I do have a question
All right,
that would be
fantastic.
relevant. For this photo, and I believe for any other ones that you would like to share, this is coming in from Robert.
Okay.
He's curious, what f-stop settings, speed, ISO do you use for each picture, if you've got examples?
Well, it really depends on what I'm shooting. Everything is going to be different. If I'm shooting a landscape, I'll be using a smaller aperture so that I extend my depth of field, so that everything from near to far is sharp. So my typical landscape photo, I might be shooting at f11 or f16 to get everything from the foreground to the background sharp. The shutter speed isn't really relevant in a situation like that, and unless I've got something moving and I don't want it to be moving. ISO for my landscape work is typically the lowest ISO that I can use to keep the image quality maximized. If you're using a higher ISO, you start introducing digital noise. With wildlife photography in the winter, my main variable is typically shutter speed because I want to freeze the action of a moving subject, or I might be hand holding and I want to make sure that I'm not shaking the camera in the lens with my hands, so I use a higher shutter speed, typically 1/500th of a second or maybe higher if I've got a moving subject. And then that, the aperture is going to be less important. Usually with wildlife, I'm shooting wide open because I want to narrow my depth of field and only have my wildlife subject in focus and have the background out of focus. And I'll use a shutter speed I'll use an ISO that will allow me to get the shutter speed that I want with the light that I have. So all of these are variables. None of them are set in stone. Everything is reciprocal of each other. If you adjust one aperture, ISO, or shutter speed, or the level of the available light to get the same exposure value, you have to adjust something else in the opposite direction. So these all really depend on the conditions, what I'm shooting. There is nothing, there's no golden rule I can give you for any of these variables. It all depends on what you're shooting and the conditions that you're shooting in. Okay? All right. Fantastic. With this next photo, this is another example of how winter light can really transform your image. So having that beautiful sunrise light on the Grand Tetons made this image possible. But what was really critical to this was the layer of fresh snow. I don't like old snow. Old snow gets drab. There's a lot of footprints in old snow. It sometimes gets dirty. And I also don't like it when there's not a lot of snow, because you get all sorts of ugly things poking up from the ground, like fallen twigs and ugly winter shrubbery without any leaves on it. So a nice thick layer of fresh snow will transform your winter scenes and make them so much more photogenic. So I am usually waiting for big snow events to happen, and that's when I'm out there ready to go. I like to shoot when it's snowing, especially if it's snowing hard, because it can add that wintry, ethereal mood to your photos. And I like to be there on location when the skies break open and you get a lot of gorgeous light on that fresh winter landscape. So lots and lots of fresh snow is critical. So wait for those big snow events. Here's another example of ice. This is on Lake Superior in the winter. You get these ice caves that form because there's all these cliffs and sandstone caves on the shore of Lake Superior, and there's water seeping through the rock. And in the winter, all that seeping water becomes these giant pillars of ice. So for this particular shot, I had walked out along the ice for several miles to get to this one particular ice cave. And I like to incorporate the sun, if I can, in my ice and winter images. So having that sunburst, that sun star effect, can be a really nice way to draw attention to a specific part of your composition and to make the overall composition more attractive. And what I typically do is stop down to a small aperture like f11 or f16 to make the burst effect more pronounced. And it's a good idea to partially block the sun by something, because if the sun's out completely in the open, you'll get a lot of lens flare, which is not very attractive. But if you partially block it with the side of the cliff, as I did here, or with one of the icicles hanging down, or with a tree or a cloud or something like that, you can reduce the amount of flare that you get and still get that really nice starburst effect. All right, here's another example of how light can transform a winter scene. And also, I talked earlier about that inversion effect. When you get the mixture of moisture and cold air, you can often get these layers of fog. And when the sun is shining through that moisture, you can get some really interesting sunbeam effects. So that's what's going on here. This was taken in the Grand Teton National Park, and there was this lone tree, just an ugly tree, kind of like Charlie Brown's Christmas tree. No one loves it. I remember seeing this tree in summer, and you wouldn't even look twice at it driving by. But there was this inversion effect in the mountains at night. It got very, very cold, and this layer of fog formed. And everywhere the fog floated, it covered the landscape in this layer of rime ice. So this thick ice coating covered the trees and the ground. And so the next morning, this lone ugly tree became incredibly photogenic. As the sun rose high enough and was shining down through the layer of fog, it created all these sunbeams, and that lone tree got backlit as a result. And oops, trying to zoom in just so you can see it. So the backlighting on the tree makes it really stand out against that dark background. So looking for these interesting atmospheric effects, looking for that really strong light is critical to making successful outdoor winter photographs. And as you can see from that photo, even though it was probably 2 hours after sunrise, so the light doesn't have any color to it, in the winter, even that middle of the day light can look really, really good. So look to juxtapose shadow and light with your winter photographs, and you'll have really successful photographs. You gotta be careful with your exposure though, because you've got all this bright snow and then these dark shadows. So you want to make sure that you don't overexpose that bright snow. So you want to avoid those blinkies appearing on your camera LCD. You want to make sure that you don't push your histogram too far to the right, because when you overexpose those highlights, you're going to lose all detail in them. So you want to make sure you're not overexposing those bright whites. And as long as you do that, you can make really great winter photographs, even in mixed lighting. All right, so this next photo was in Yellowstone National Park. This is a red fox who was taking a nap and woke up briefly to yawn. And you can see how having really deep snow can be great for winter photographs, because it presents this kind of blank canvas, this clean slate that you're working on. And winter can be a great time for wildlife. So there's a lot of species that get active in interesting ways in the winter. So in winter you can see coyotes and fox mousing in a field. They're still looking for food, but the mice and the rodents that they eat are deep underneath the snow. And so the coyotes and the fox will listen for the mice and the rodents, and when they hear something, they dive into the snow. And it's really funny because basically they dive in nose first, and all you see is their tail sticking out of the snow. And then they pop back up, and if they're lucky, they've got a mouse in their mouth. So you can see a lot of interesting behaviors. In the winter, you get a lot of species that you don't see during the summer. And there's a lot of great opportunities for winter wildlife. So check your local area to see if you get any seasonal wildlife events that are worth photographing. All right, this next photograph was taken once again on Lake Superior, and this is a photo that many of you have probably seen before. This is me exploring the ice caves on Lake Superior. I actually hiked over the ice on the lake over open water for about 3 or 4 miles to reach this set of caves on an island. And so the ice was very thick that year. Basically all of Lake Superior froze over, or most of it. So I knew that the ice was thick enough to get me out there. But I was traveling alone, so I brought my ice axe with me to probe the ice. I was also wearing a dry suit over all of my warm winter clothing so that if I did fall in, if I did find a weak spot, I knew that I was going to stay dry and warm. When you fall into the water, when it's that cold out, the shock and the hypothermia can kill you pretty quickly. So you want to be extra careful, especially if you're traveling alone. And I recommend that you don't travel alone, bring a friend. So I made it out safely to these caves. And it was great because I pretty much had the whole place to myself. And I was out there all day making photographs. And this is a self-portrait that I set up. I had a wide-angle lens on my camera set up inside the cave looking out. And I would basically use my 10-second timer, trigger the shutter, and then I would run outside of the cave and walk by so that there was a human presence in this landscape photo. So that's how I took this shot. And I think that's the end of the photos and my winter photography tips. So I hope that you find these tips to be helpful. Please be safe when you're out there. As I said, be very, very cautious when you're on ice and approaching the edges of the ice. It's better to be safe than sorry. And make sure you dress appropriately. Get out there with a lot of layers. As you're moving around, you might warm up. So you want to make sure you have enough clothing that when you are standing still for long periods of time, you'll stay warm. So you want to dress for the inevitability of being in the same place for a few hours, because when you're doing outdoor photography, you might find a really cool composition, but you have to wait for the bright light. So you might find it an hour before sunrise, and you might have to stand there and wait an hour before sunset. You might have to stand there and wait for an hour until the sun sets and you get the light that you want. And so you're going to get cold. So it's good to have the extra layers to put on and stay warm. So make sure that you've got enough warm clothing to protect you while you're out there standing still for a long period of time. Don't dress for moving around, dress for standing still. When you're moving around, take off some of those bigger, bulkier layers because you're warming up. And then when you're standing still, as you cool back down, you can put those heavier layers back on. I always have a synthetic garment underlayer, and I might have several different shirts. I have like maybe underwear layer, and then I might have another shirt on top of that, and then I might have a fleece on top of that, and then I have a down jacket that I put over that. Make sure you wear a nice warm hat, and bring warm mittens. What I do is I'll wear a thin pair of liner gloves, and then a thicker pair of warm mittens over that, like down mittens. So that way my fingers stay warm, and when I need the extra dexterity to manipulate camera controls, I can take my hands out for short periods of time to press the little buttons and to trigger the shutter, and then as soon as my hands get cold, they go back into those thick mittens or into my pockets so that my hands stay warm. All right, do we have any questions?
Well, you answered a few.
I did.
With that one. Alan was curious about very specific winter gear that you have, and Michael kind of expanded on that a little bit with a fun question. So I'll ask it to start. Ian, what are your must-haves for your winter bag? Any specialty clothes? You kind of covered that. But snacks for your hike? A slower and tastier friend that you can dispose of if the need arises?
That is an excellent point. Yes, you should always bring a slower, tastier, meatier friend, not only to sacrifice in case there's a polar bear attack, because you never know when a polar bear is just going to come out of nowhere, but also if you get hungry, it's nice. No, this is veering off into really dark territory. Yeah, I mean, if you think you might get trapped in the wilderness for like 2 weeks, then you want to bring a tastier friend with you. But otherwise, probably a good idea to avoid any sort of cannibalism while you're out in the field. It is better to bring some snacks along with you. So the key things, as I said, are keeping warm. And it's nice to have like a thermos with some warm liquid. That's a good way of warming yourself up really quickly. To me, though, it's your extremities. It's your fingers and your toes that are probably going to get cold before anything else. So I wear a pair of thick insulated boots, depending on how cold it is outside. So, for example, in a few weeks, I'm going to be in Mongolia, which is just a little bit colder than Minneapolis in winter. And I know I'm going to be out in this frozen wasteland for several hours on end making photographs, and I'm probably not going to be moving around too much. So I've got like super thick insulated winter boots. These boots are rated down to like minus 148 degrees Fahrenheit. So with any luck, they'll keep me very warm. However, I wouldn't be wearing those if instead of it being minus 40 out, it was only like 30 degrees out. Those would be way, way too warm. So I dress for the weather that's out there, for me standing still in the weather that's out there. So if it's warmer out in the winter, I might wear a pair of normal boots or a pair of lightly insulated boots. If it's really, really cold, like if it gets down below 0 Fahrenheit, then I'm breaking out my thicker insulated boots that will keep me warm no matter how, they keep me warm in space, basically. That's how warm those boots are. And so I just dressed appropriate to the weather. Another thing to consider is that the cold can wreak havoc on your equipment. So having spare batteries is a good idea. If you're getting a lot of battery drain because of the cold, like modern lithium-ion batteries actually do pretty well in the cold. But some cameras, especially like mirrorless cameras that operate using live view all the time, they might burn through their batteries pretty quickly in the winter. So one thing to do is always have a few charged spares with you and keep your batteries, the spares, as well as the battery that you're using in a warm inside pocket in your jacket. And then just take the battery out and put it in the camera when you're ready to shoot, because that way the battery stays warm and you're going to have a lot more battery power as a result. And also another thing to think about if you're shooting in really cold environments is that your shutter might actually freeze open or close. I've had this happen. Like if I've been out in places where it was well below 0 Fahrenheit, especially if there's a little bit of moisture in the air, you'll sometimes get your shutter freezing. And the best thing you can do for that is just take your camera into a warm place. Put it inside a warm pocket or a warm car or a warm room and let it warm up until the shutter unsticks. Do not stick your finger in your camera and try to get the shutter to move on it. That's a bad idea. So those are really the only things you have to worry about with your gear. Also, when you're going from like a cold outside to a warm inside, if your lenses are out and the lens caps are off, you can often get condensation forming really quickly on your lenses, and it might form on the inside of the lenses as well. And it takes a while when you get that condensation forming to get it off of your lens. So the best way to avoid that, it's pretty simple. You don't have to do anything fancy. Just put all of your camera gear inside your camera bag before you take it inside and leave it in the bag. Let the bag gradually warm up to room temperature, and then you can take your lenses and your camera out and you won't have any condensation problems at all.
Well, you're reading people's minds still. Jameson had left a question earlier on about batteries losing charge in the cold, so you're just clicking through them.
Yeah, I mean, like, some batteries, like I don't have any problems. My Canon camera, the batteries actually last a really long time typically, and in the winter, I don't really find that they drain that much faster, but I do know some people with other camera systems, as I said, especially those mirrorless camera systems where you're constantly using live view, you might find that your battery performance declines. And I know for a fact that my iPhone, which I'll sometimes use for certain camera operations, like, I used to use it for flying my drone. The iPhone would plug into the controller and it would be the control screen for my drone. But in the winter, I can't use it because the battery doesn't die any quicker, but the iPhone just doesn't operate in the cold well. Like the electronics just freeze up, and the thing just dies even though there's still charge on the battery. So you might have problems like that with some camera equipment. So a lot of this equipment that might not be rated for extreme cold. So if you find that your camera just doesn't handle the cold, as I said, the best thing you can do is put it back in your pocket, inside pocket, warm it up, and then you should be good to go again.
All right, let's move on to a question from William.
All right, hello, William.
Hi, William asks, what is the best way to remove noise from high ISO photos?
Well, so there's a lot of different ways to remove noise, and there's two types of noise that you'll often get on these photos. You'll get something that's called luminosity noise, which is basically just grain that appears in your image. It doesn't have any color. And then there's color noise, which you'll see is much different. It's basically these like random dots of the primary colors that you find in your photograph, RGB, which is red, green, and blue. So when you're working in most image processing programs, there's a noise removal option. Like in Lightroom, for example, you can remove luminosity noise and you can remove color noise. Now, color noise is typically easier to get rid of. Now, I don't see a lot of color noises in the images that I'm taking with my land camera, but with my drone, which has a much smaller sensor, it's prone to a lot of color noise. And in Adobe Lightroom, I can just basically turn up the color noise removal to like 100%, and it gets rid of the color noise, and it doesn't do anything to really diminish image quality. So color noise is a lot easier to get rid of. You can zap it completely without diminishing overall image quality that much or at all. Luminosity noise, on the other hand, which is much more common with any type of image sensor, that's more difficult to get rid of, because as you adjust the slider for the luminosity noise to get rid of it, it is going to end up blurring the image. So you're going to reduce image quality. So it's a bit trickier to get rid of, and there's a lot of different sliders typically, so you can adjust all these different settings to get rid of the noise without degrading image quality that much. There's a lot of plugins offered by third parties like Noise Ninja. I don't even know what's out there because I don't really use anything other than the Adobe noise reduction tools if I need them. But there's a lot of different programs out there that allow you to get rid of noise. And they're all pretty good, but sometimes you're going to have to make a trade-off between image quality and noise removal. The best way to get rid of noise is to avoid it altogether. And the best way to do that is to try to shoot at the lowest ISO possible, because when you expand your ISO, that's really just enhancing the sensor's sensitivity to light. And when you do that, basically you start introducing digital noise into the process. So if you shoot at your lowest ISO possible, you'll reduce the amount of noise. Also, if you make sure to properly expose your images, digital noise resides in unexposed areas of the photograph or underexposed areas of the photograph. And so there's more data in a digital file in the brighter exposure areas. So you get digital noise in these darker areas, especially when you try to increase your exposure in the image processing phase. So if you increase your exposure when you're taking the photograph, you give the camera more exposure, that's going to reduce the amount of digital noise. So there's the old adage of shooting to the right, which means when you're making a photograph, look at your histogram and push the histogram to the point as far to the right as you can without overexposing or clipping any of your highlights. So by pushing that overall exposure to the right of the histogram as much as possible, you're going to minimize the amount of noise that you get in the underexposed and shadow areas of the photograph. You can always, even if it looks too bright in camera, you can always bring the exposure back down when you're processing the image to make it look right, and you'll have a cleaner file. Just don't overexpose your highlights. If you push the histogram so far to the right that you get those spikes going up on the right side of the histogram, that means you've overexposed your highlights. You can't recover detail in those parts of the photograph. They're just going to be rendered as this blank white, and it's really unattractive. So expose as far to the right as possible without overexposing your highlights.
All right, let's move on to a question from Vivian.
Hi, Vivian.
Vivian asks, have you been successful in taking photos during a snowfall? And follow-up, have you attempted to photograph in a snowstorm?
Ah, yes. I love making photographs in a snowstorm. Some of my favorite polar bear images were taken when it was a blizzard out, and you can barely see the bears at all. And as a matter of fact, it's really difficult to use autofocus when the snow is that thick. So yeah, you can make photographs in a heavy snowstorm. It'll add this ethereal, wintry mood to your photos. And it can be really great because you kind of get that white on white look, that high key look, which can be very artistic. I think the biggest challenge is when you're shooting through heavy snow. If the snow is wet, then you're going to get all this wet snow on your camera and your lens. So you might need something like a rain cover or a plastic bag that you want to throw over your equipment to keep it from getting wet. If the snow is blowing into your lens, whether it's wet or not, you can get a lot of snow building up on the lens itself, and that can be problematic, especially if you are using a lens hood. You can get a lot of snow, basically a snowdrift builds up inside your lens. It just lands on the lens hood and builds up. So if you notice that things begin to look very misty as you're looking through your lens, that probably means that snow is building up and blocking your view. So you want to make sure that you're keeping that lens dry and keeping the snow off of it. So having a lens cloth to wipe the snow off is a good idea. Also, when the snow hits your lens, even if the snow is cold, even if it's not a very moist snow, if the lens is warmer than the outside air, then that snow is probably going to start melting. So that snow might turn into water, condensation on your lens. So you want to make sure you can wipe that off. And the other challenge, as I said, might be with autofocus. If there's too much snow in between you and your subject, there might not be a lot of contrast. And you need contrast, you need that visual acuity for autofocus to work. So you might have a lot of difficulty autofocusing on your subject when it's really heavy blowing snow. So if that's the case, you might want to try manually focusing instead. It's really the only option that you have. So if you find that your autofocus is hunting back and forth, turn it off, switch over to manual focus, and just do the best you can.
All right, that actually answers a couple questions that came in. One
Wow,
from a guest.
I am on fire
It is
today.
amazing, and Stan had a follow-up
Yes.
asking specifically about rain sleeves and anything else that you would use for your camera when it is snowing.
Let me see if I can guess the next question. Well,
I
hold on a
don't
second.
think you can.
Okay, wait. It's going to be a question. No, okay, I can't guess it. Go ahead.
It actually is a little callback to earlier in the discussion, but it's worth revisiting when we're talking about some equipment and things. It's from Jorge, and I am going to start with a little mini quiz.
Mini quiz, okay.
Jorge wants to know, why did the bodybuilder get a tattoo of Frosty on his stomach?
Why did the bodybuilder get a tattoo of Frosty on his stomach?
Yes.
Frosty the Snowman.
Yes.
On his stomach. I'm stumped. This is a good one. Like, do you have any theories? You know the answer then.
I'm cheating. I can see the answer. It's provided to me. It's pretty fantastic.
Okay.
He wanted an abdominal snowman.
Oh, my God, that's so awesome. I should have known that joke. Jorge, I'm going to borrow that joke, and I'm going to use it on my photo workshops from now on.
It's perfect.
Abdominal snowman?
Winter photography, abdominal snowman. There, now that he has our attention.
All right.
Is there a way to acclimate your camera to different temperatures? I'm wondering if the condensation that builds up from taking my lens from indoors to outdoors will ruin it. I know you talked vice versa earlier.
That shouldn't be a problem. Usually the condensation forms when you've got a cold camera hitting warmer, moist air. I don't think I've ever really had the opposite happen going out into very, very cold. If it's below freezing, I'm trying to think, usually the best way is, as I said, just make sure your gear is in the camera bag as you're changing environments. That way, the camera bag will provide a little bit of insulation, and the camera equipment will warm up or cool down at a slower rate. It's that rapid warming or cooling that probably causes the condensation. So if it gradually cools down before you take your equipment out, you shouldn't have any problems. But I don't think I've ever had a problem going out when it was below freezing. And having condensation forming. Usually it's a problem if I leave like a warm hotel room and go out and it's cold but not below freezing. So like in the spring or the fall, sometimes you'll have this cool, moist air outside. And if you have like a really warm equipment, you might get some condensation then. But usually I've never had a problem going out in the winter when it's below freezing. But as I said, the best way to do it, just keep it in your camera bag. Your camera bag's like a mini cooler, and it will allow your equipment to gradually warm up or cool down, avoiding condensation issues. You don't have to do anything other than that. Like, I've seen a lot of people recommend all these fancy methods for avoiding condensation. Just keep it in the camera bag, keep the bag zipped up, and just let your equipment gradually change temperature, and you should be fine.
Perfect. All right, thank you, Jorge. Let's move on to Nora. Nora has a question.
Does Nora have a joke?
Nora just has a question, but it is a very good one.
I'm disappointed.
Super useful. Nora wants to know if you have issues with footprints in the snow when it comes to your shots.
Yes. That's why I recommend waiting for fresh snow, because you'll just end up with old snow. It's just ugly. You get all sorts of footprints. And sometimes you can get like cool footprints, like animal footprints, can make a nice winter photograph subject. But more often than not, you just end up with lots and lots of footprints that ruin the overall look of your winter images. And so you have to be careful when you're out there. It's the same thing when you're photographing in like sand dunes. You got to be careful where you walk. So that's the worst thing that can happen is you're out there in that fresh winter landscape and you're exploring, looking for great compositions, and you find the perfect composition only to realize that you've just walked right through it. So be very, very careful. And when you think you see something cool, take out your camera and your lens and look at it through your viewfinder as you're approaching it. Because you don't want to go too far forward and realize that the better view, the better composition was a foot or two back. So make sure you have that camera in front of your face and slowly move your way up into the composition. And that way, when you find the perfect spot, you can stop there and not move any forward. So what I'll often do with a winter landscape is I'll find a spot that I think is good, and I'll get a few shots at that spot. If I then want to experiment with moving forward, at least I've got a few good photographs. Because it may be that, you know, a foot closer is the perfect spot, but I don't want to ruin it, so I start back, and when the light happens, I take some photographs, and then I slowly, incrementally move deeper into the scene, and that way, if I find what I like, I'm good to go. If I found that by moving forward, I pushed the envelope too much, at least I've got those initial shots that I took, and so I haven't ruined the whole shoot. So yes, be very, very careful where you go, and this is where having a friend with you is a bad idea. That slower, tastier, heavier friend might leave a bunch of really unattractive footprints in your ideal composition.
Uh-oh.
So you want to have a slower, heavier, tastier friend who also takes orders and stays out of your shots.
Perfect. These seem like rare friends. I think that
Yes.
This is starting to become a very long list.
That's why I'm launching a new app called Disposable Photo Friend Finder that allows you to find the perfect photo friend who you wouldn't mind losing just in case you have a polar bear attack you.
It's hard to get people to sign up for it. Oh, let's move on to a question from a guest.
It's easy to get people to sign up for it. It's just that most people who sign up don't realize that they're the disposable friend.
Got it. Well, let's go on to a guest question.
All right, guest. Hello, guest.
Hi. One of the things I struggle with for winter photography is exposure. What are your metering tips for all of that whiteness?
Okay, so yeah, metering can be very difficult in the winter. And as I was talking earlier, if you're working in mixed light, you want to make sure that you're not overexposing your highlights. If you're working in flatter light, the camera is going to have a tendency to try to underexpose the image. So basically, when your camera meter reads a scene, it's assuming that the scene is sort of this neutral middle exposure. So if you're photographing something really bright or really dark, the camera is going to pick an exposure that makes that dark or bright thing look somewhere in the middle. So if you're photographing a black door, for example, and you fill the frame with black, then the camera is going to try to overexpose that. So you're going to end up with something that looks gray instead of black. And it's the opposite when you're photographing, let's say, a field of fresh winter snow. It's going to see all that bright white, and it's going to assume that it's not bright white, that it's something in the middle, and it's going to underexpose the image. So a lot of the time you're going to want to give those winter photographs extra exposure. So usually I go to like +1 or maybe even +2 exposure compensation. And that keeps that white snow looking like white snow. So for example, with some of the photos I showed you earlier, especially like those polar bear photos that I take, where it might be, white bear against a white snowy background, or, that red fox photo, I'm gonna go back to it. Most of the red fox photo here is a white snowy background. So if I had just let the camera expose the way it thought was appropriate, the resulting photo would be too dark and the snow would look kind of dingy. So I gave this photo extra exposure. So I set my exposure compensation probably to like somewhere between +1 and +2 for this particular shot. And that would allow the camera to get the proper exposure. And so basically what you want to do is give it, as I said earlier, give your shots as much exposure as you can. Push that histogram to the right as much as you can without overexposing the highlights. So for the photo of the fox, if I had given it too much exposure, all of that white snow would have been overexposed and would have had no detail in it whatsoever. So I pushed the exposure as far to the right as I could without overexposing the whites. And then when I'm processing the photo, if I think it looks too bright, I can darken it and I'll have detail in the whites, which is critical for this photograph. You don't want to lose that detail. You don't want to have that look completely white and overexposed. You want to have enough detail in the snow that you can, You can see it as snow. It's not overexposed, but you still want it bright enough so that it looks like white snow and not gray, dingy snow.
All right. This is a follow-up, a little bit of something that you touched on earlier. Max K is asking, if it's snowing, how do you combat focus fluttering as it struggles to find your subject with all of the snow in the foreground?
Yeah, like, you might have problems with lack of contrast in the scene if it's snowing too hard and the autofocus can't really grab onto anything. If you've got these big snowflakes, you might have the camera trying to focus on the snowflakes instead of your subject. And there's not much you can really do to avoid this. Most camera systems are fairly sophisticated and will do a pretty good job. But on occasion, you may have it so that the autofocus is picking up one of those big snowflakes and going back and forth. You can usually change your autofocus sensitivity settings. Every camera model has got like a different way of doing it. And so you might want to experiment with some of these different settings if your camera offers them. But the best thing you can do if autofocus just isn't working is turn it off and switch over to manual focus. It's not an ideal solution, and it works best if you've got a subject that's not moving back and forth. Once you get focused on it, then you can turn the autofocus off and just keep shooting. If your subject is moving, you're just going to have to deal with the fact that you might not be getting good focus. The best thing you can do in a situation like that, if your focus is fluttering back and forth, is just keep shooting. And anytime focus locks on, take those shots and just keep your fingers crossed. It's a good idea to do what I call spray and pray. Take lots and lots of shots, and hopefully you'll get some good ones. There's just nothing you can do about it, though, if your focus is bouncing back and forth. It's just something you got to live with. It's a challenge that you have to overcome by being patient and persistent.
Perfect. Oh, we've got a very specific equipment question coming in from Patrick.
Hello, Patrick.
Does the cold temperature during winter decrease how far away your drone can fly?
That's a great question. And in theory, no. But what can diminish your range is if that battery gets cold and isn't at optimal output. Now, what I do with my drone is I keep my batteries in my pocket while I'm moving around if I'm outside. And then I only put the battery in when I'm ready to fly. And when the drone is flying, it actually warms up quite a bit. The battery warms up. So even if it's really cold out, the native heat generated by the flying drone should be enough to combat that. So I haven't really noticed any diminishment in performance. But there probably is a bit of a diminishment in performance. And some of the more advanced drones out there actually will have like a heater pack on the drone that keeps the battery warm. I've noticed this in some of the higher end professional models, like the DJI Inspire series. They offer it with a battery pack. But the truth is, as long as you keep that battery warm and put it in when you're ready to fly, the battery should heat up enough that even if you're flying in the cold air, you're not going to really notice that much of a degradation of performance.
Perfect.
Yeah, the main challenges I've had have been with using my phone as a display screen with the controller. So for my Mavic 2 Pro drone, I actually got DJI's smart controller, which is designed to operate in colder weather and doesn't use a phone. So my iPhone is useless when it's cold out, and so I use the smart controller instead, and that has better performance in the cold weather. So that's it.
Okay, we actually have two of this question.
All right.
It was first asked by Bobby, and next followed up by Ken.
All right.
And they both are curious, do you shoot only manual or do you use auto settings with bracketing?
Okay, so I actually typically don't shoot manual mode that often. So I will use the priority modes, and I will use a different mode depending on what I'm shooting. So if I'm shooting landscape, with a landscape photograph, typically the most important variable is aperture because it sets my depth of field, and that is what is going to determine what's in focus from near to far. So I will shoot aperture priority when I am shooting landscape, and I'll use exposure compensation to adjust my exposure up or down depending on what the scene calls for. With wildlife, usually my primary concern is shutter speed because you want to stop the action of moving wildlife, or if you're hand-holding your big telephoto lens, you need to have a high enough shutter speed to keep the natural shake of your hands and arms from creating a blurry image. So I'm shooting in shutter priority when I'm shooting wildlife. And aperture can also be important with wildlife. Like almost always, I want to shoot wide open so that I have very narrow depth of field, so only my wildlife subject's in focus. But I'm typically shooting wildlife when it's low light. Like I don't go out in the middle of the day when it's really bright. I'm usually shooting sunrise and sunset when the light's really nice. And so as a result, almost always my camera is automatically choosing that wide open aperture because I just don't have enough light for it to stop down to something smaller. If you're shooting in really bright light, even if you're at like 1/1000th of a second, there might be so much light that you automatically end up with a smaller aperture. So if you want to avoid that smaller aperture when you're shooting in shutter priority when it's bright enough, it might be a good idea to shoot in manual so you can set your shutter speed and your aperture, and then hopefully you can get your ISO to the right point so that you still have a proper exposure. If it's really, really bright out, then you might have to stop down to use a smaller aperture. It might be unavoidable. You might be at a high shutter speed and you might have your lowest ISO and it still might be so bright that you end up using like F11 or F16 with your wildlife photo. But that happens. If it's just too bright, there's only so much you can do to adjust the variables. So I'm sorry, I'm making this answer a bit more confusing and complicated than it needs to be. So yeah, aperture priority for landscape, shutter priority typically for wildlife, though occasionally I might switch over to manual if my aperture is also an important variable. And then I use exposure compensation in these priority modes to adjust my exposure if my camera is getting the wrong exposure. Your camera meter will make a best guess for the proper exposure, and a lot of times it's right. The camera meter is pretty smart, but sometimes it's wrong. Especially with a winter scene, you're going to need to make exposure adjustments. So I use exposure compensation to adjust my exposure brighter or darker as necessary.
All right, we're getting into a little less than 10 minutes left in the hour. We've got a question from Joan, and Jules has seconded to this question. I am jealous of your snow, Joan says. I live on Long Island, New York, and we have gotten very little snow this year. Mm-hmm. Can you suggest alternative settings for winter pics without snow?
Well, so when you don't have snow, you can always switch over to focusing your efforts on ice. Ice can make a great subject. You can get ice even if you don't have snow. And so ice can make a really great intimate subject. There's might be some interesting patterns in the ice. You might use the ice as a foreground. Another thing you can do is to just take a little drive. I know leaving Long Island and trying to drive through New York City isn't just a short drive. But if you can, get through that traffic and head up the thruway past Albany, you hit, upstate New York, you hit the Adirondack Mountains, suddenly you've got plenty of snow. So that's another thing you can do. I grew up in upstate New York, and I used to live in New York City and Long Island, so I know exactly what you're going through. And yeah, winter can be very challenging there, but ice can make a really interesting subject. So one thing that I look for in the winter, if I'm in an area where there's not a lot of snow, is maybe streams and waterfalls. Waterfalls in particular, if they freeze over, if you've got an overhanging waterfall, if you can get behind that overhanging ice, you find yourself inside this neat ice cave, and that can be a really good subject. But ice is one thing you can do. Now, if you're not out photographing nature, if you're doing maybe some travel or street photography when it's cold and there's no snow, you can still get some interesting things without snow. In particular, when it gets cold, a lot of cities I've been in, if I'm doing street photography in the winter, you'll often get warm, moist air coming up from steam grates or from storm tunnels and things like that. And you could get that backlit in the winter. You could get some really interesting effects. So you may just want to switch the type of photography that you're doing. But I think looking for interesting ice, looking for interesting patterns of ice forming on streams and lakes and ponds is a really good substitute if you don't have good snow.
All right, hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah.
Mark asks, do you have special feet that you use on your tripod for shooting ice?
I thought that the question was, do you have special feet?
Maybe also that.
Yeah, well, if you consider really tiny feet, special feet, yes, I have special feet. Some people will use spiked feet in the winter one thing that can be a bit of a challenge when you're working on slippery ice is that your tripod will be sliding back and forth and it's hard to keep it in position. So some tripods come with these little spikes that you can twist out. Other times you can buy spiked feet, and this will give you better grip and traction in the winter. So that's always an option. Typically I've never really found it to be too much of a problem. Most ice isn't so slippery that your tripod is going to be moving around, but it can be an issue, and having spiked feet will solve it. And it's also useful to have spiked feet on your feet when you're walking around. If the ice is slippery enough so that your tripod is moving around, then it's definitely slippery enough that you're going to be sliding around. So going out and buying, you can buy inexpensive, they're not really crampons, they're just these little spiked accessories you can put over your winter boots that have got these tiny little metal spikes on them. And they're relatively inexpensive. You can buy them for 30, 40 bucks. And they're a great way of very easily making you ice accessible when that ice is really slippery. So you only need full-on crampons if you're doing ice climbing. So these spiked feet accessories are really useful to making sure that you don't go slipping and falling when you're trying to do winter photography.
All right, 3-minute lightning round.
Okay, here we go.
First from a guest, will you be photographing the wild horses in Mongolia?
I don't know. I'm not exactly sure. I'm guessing I'll see some horses when I'm in Mongolia. There's probably more horses than people there. So we'll just have to see. I have no idea what I'm going to be encountering. I just know it's going to be really, really cold.
Stay tuned.
Yes, we'll see.
Let's move on to another guest. Might have missed this information, sorry. My questions are, what equipment are you using for landscape and wildlife shots? Camera and lens, I'm looking to upgrade.
Oh, well, I mean, we could probably spend a whole session talking about the equipment that I'm using. Just generally, I'm using Canon cameras, and I'm using a mix of Canon and Tamron lenses. And so I've got a lot of different lenses for wildlife than I do for my landscape work. So I could spend a lot more time than we have remaining to describe all my equipment. So I'm just going to give you kind of a general idea. But most modern camera systems out there, you can't go wrong. There's so many good cameras and lenses out there that you should be fine no matter what you pick.
Good luck.
Yeah.
Anna has sent in a question. Where have you experienced the coldest temps when you're photographing?
Let's see. The coldest temperatures I have experienced so far have probably been, let me think. It's been pretty cold here in the Midwest. When I first moved to Minnesota, it was about 5 or 6 years ago. That was the year that we all learned the phrase polar vortex. There was that giant polar Arctic blast that came down, and it was so cold that winter that almost the entire lake of Lake Superior froze over. And so that was pretty cold. I remember it being minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit in Minneapolis as the high during the middle of the day for weeks on end.
Yes.
So at night it would get down to minus 20 or minus 30. And so yeah, I was out photographing in some of those conditions where it'd be minus 20 to minus 30, and it gets pretty cold. And that's about as cold as I've ever had it myself personally. But in Mongolia, I should be experiencing minus 30 to minus 40 degree temperatures.
Ooh,
Yeah.
so perhaps that will be the new
Yes.
winner for coldest.
If I come back with all my fingers and toes, I'm going to have some great stories for you.
All right. 2 questions to go. We have another one from a guest. Would you recommend or ever consider using hand warmers on a lens?
So hand warmers on a lens might be kind of interesting. I'm not sure that you really need, I guess the only reason to use the hand warmers on the lens would be if you're worried about condensation going in and out of the cold into a warm room or something like that. I guess that could, in theory, some people use them if they're doing night photography, for long exposures, to keep the lens warm so that condensation doesn't form on the lens. But I think that's something that's more common when it's above freezing. When it's below freezing, you shouldn't have to worry about condensation forming on your lens during long exposures. So that's typically something that people use for night exposures. Now, using hand warmers, chemical or battery hand warmers for your hands while you're doing photography, that is something that people do use, and it can definitely increase your comfort level. I don't typically use them myself because I prefer to have gear with me that's going to keep me warm no matter what. You know, chemical and battery hand warmers and toe warmers are wonderful until they stop working, which inevitably they do. And then if you don't have the right gear, your toes and fingers can get very, very cold. So I just make sure that I have gear that's warm enough to keep my toes and fingers cold no matter what. And then I don't need those hand warmers, but they definitely can make things more comfortable for you. Just make sure that whatever gear you have is going to keep you warm when the battery runs out or when the chemical pack stops working.
All right, last question from Ken.
All right.
Have you gotten winter sundogs into a landscape?
Yes. So basically what a sundog is ice crystals in the air, and you see it forming around the sun. So it kind of looks like a really faint rainbow that forms around the sun. And I've actually seen this not so much in the winter as I have in places like Patagonia where there's like really big mountains and there's a lot of cold air above the mountain. So I've got some shots from Fitzroy in Patagonia where there is like a full halo around the sun. So it looks like a rainbow around the sun, a very faint rainbow without a lot of color. So I've definitely seen these halos, and it's a good thing to look for them. And sundogs basically are the same thing, but they are incomplete halos. So you might just see this like colorful little rainbow that forms in part of the sky, and that's what a sundog is. So preferably you want enough ice crystals in the air so you get that full halo around the sun. If you can get that, that can be pretty cool. This is typically something that's going to happen when it's really cold out. So you've got like basically the ice is very brittle. And if it starts breaking up and it's windy, you get all these ice crystals in the air. And that's when you've got the best chance of seeing sundogs or these halo effects in the winter.
All right, that closes out our hour.
All right, well, thank you very much, guys. This was a very robust and intense session. You can tell that my voice is beginning to fail. I haven't been keeping properly hydrated, which, by the way, is another winter tip. Make sure you drink plenty of water. So all I can say is it's time for you guys to get out there, stay warm, and I hope that these tips will help you make amazing winter photographs. I'm Ian Plant.
I am Leah Zahner, and just a reminder, follow us on social media, Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, and Twitter to keep you tided over until the next live session.
Wow, Pinterest. Okay.
We've got it all.
All right, well, thanks, and we'll see you next time. Bye.